We have great stuff to do. How are you all feeling? Everybody's good?
Yes.
Everyone parked, obviously. You managed to park, which is the amazing thing. So, let's get underway. I'm going to start with a question, and we'll see where it takes us, okay? Have you changed in the course of your life? Don't say anything yet. Have you changed in the course of your life? Think about that. Excuse me. How have you changed? And why have you made those changes which you made? So I'm not asking if you changed your clothes or something like that. I'm sort of asking for a macro, mega question. Have you changed in your life? And how so, and why? So now you can say something. If no one's changed, then that ends that conversation. Let's just have coffee and we'll call it quits. Thank you.
Yes.
So can you, if you could share it with me. So.
What changed me the most was becoming pregnant and becoming a mother, giving birth.
Okay, there's a change. Yeah.
It changed me.
Forever.
Yes.
Because you're still a mother.
Absolutely.
Right, so that's a change. Great, yeah. Has anybody else changed? Yes.
Maturity. I look at something today totally different than how I looked at when I was younger.
So when did this happen to you?
When?
This maturity.
Probably in my upper 50s,
You think, really?
that I really noticed certain things.
That you might not have noticed before.
Never noticed
Never,
before,
okay.
or would accept.
Okay, great. So there's the two instances of change that you've experienced.
I'll add, I was thinking relationships as well. Having a child, having the death of a parent, Joan was talking about that. Those are changes, the relationship thing. There's also the maturity, but I'm also thinking change of place, meaning a geographical change, where the whole context in which I was living changed. One example was moving from Los Angeles to a small town in Wales. And so there was just, my interactions with people were different, what I had to do was different, it was a change, and I responded in turn by changing.
And it changed you, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah,
You became a different person.
yeah.
So I guess there are, obviously, every one of you, now you're going to start to think, well, yeah, come to think of it, and everyone has had, I'm sure, incremental changes, sometimes huge, sudden, transformational changes, right? Over the top kinds of things. So change happens gradually, sometimes not so gradually. Sometimes it's just in the natural course of events. If you grow older, you're going to be different than you were when you were younger. But sometimes circumstances change around you, and that forces you to change. Sometimes necessity, sometimes for better or for worse, things happen. I was thinking, if you owned and had a thriving business in a hat shop, and it was 1965, I think you know where I'm going.
Oh my God.
Change, and that ended that, right? So that would be a certain kind of change, where change was brought upon you, and by 1970 or 72 or something,
Nobody was wearing hats.
no more, it's gone. Unless you were, although that's not so funny for a distance it is perhaps, if you own a resort in St. Thomas this week, or if you owned one 3 weeks ago, then you would be an expert in forced change, right? Necessity, change by necessity, absolute, total necessity. Tell you about a change that happened to a friend of mine, because I was thinking about this. He owned a fabulous prepared food takeout kind of place. Their specialty was fried chicken on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And it was a very, very, very successful business, because everybody does takeout in Manhattan. They were at a major intersection just up from the subway station. They had a great business. But then people's diets changed. And people began to eat way less fried chicken, which was their signature dish, and all the stuff that went with it. And in the end, he had to close the business. Because great business, but there was a sushi place across the way, and he was undone by sushi, as it were. So there's different kind of change. And over the next 5 weeks, we're going to talk about change. I think the fancy name that Tom and I came with was Change or Die. But we got to that notion because we were thinking last spring about the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, which marked a sea change in European Christianity. A sea change, right? So we began to think about change and how anyone changes or how religious institutions change. And that's where we came up with this notion that we might think about, on the occasion of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, we might not talk so much about the Reformation itself, but talk about change and how it strikes or how it affects religious institutions of all sorts. So since I'm a rabbi, I'm going to do 2 sessions about change in Jewish history, which, well, we'll find out. We'll see as we talk a little bit whether it strikes chords that say, well, we do the same kind of thing has happened here at the church or in another church experience I had. Might be. But I'm going to start out with talking about the change in Judaism, and so it might be just a little informative, but hopefully you'll resonate and we'll see what comes up. So, of course, if you think even about that word reformation, the root of it is reform, which is a verb. So the Reformation caused a reform of the Christian world, right? It reformed the Christian world, or you could say it changed the Christian world. And that's where we're going to talk about change. And that's what the Reformation was. Depending on where you are in the Christian world, you think it's a good thing or a bad thing. But that's another conversation. So today I want to start with Judaism and a huge change in Judaism and how that worked itself and played itself out in Jewish history. Pretty important for me and for all of us who just want to know something about the world we're in. So let's go back to the beginning in Judaism, the original source, which is here. Oh, by the way, do some of you watch Jeopardy? So I watched Jeopardy
We have to, we're old.
Yeah. So last night's Jeopardy, I think it was last night or the night before, the final Jeopardy question, I don't know if you remember this. It was last night. It was actually. It was
a question about the Bible.
They didn't call it that though. It was a question about the Bible. They called it an Old Testament question. Now I was pretty surprised that the Jeopardy guys who were so smart would call it an Old Testament question. Using PC, they should have called it a Hebrew Bible question, because the Old Testament presupposes that there's an old and a new, that there's an old-fashioned, outmoded. So I was just shocked. By the way, the question was, what's the shortest book in the Hebrew Bible? And none of them got it. I knew it, but none of them got it. But I didn't get to the finals. Does anyone know what the shortest book is?
Obadiah.
Did you listen yesterday?
I did. I heard it last night.
And remembered.
So it's Obadiah. I once did a class on Obadiah, but only a class because it's only 21 persons. You really have to work hard to do a course on Obadiah. All right, so we're going to now talk then go back to the Hebrew Bible, and we're going to talk a little bit about Judaism. What was Judaism like in biblical times? How was it observed? How was it practiced? You tell me. In biblical times, we'll look in a minute, but your sense of it. If you were a Jewish person in King David's time or King Solomon's time, let's say, how was your Judaism practiced? Bet you never thought about that one.
Wow.
Yeah, how was it practiced? Yes?
There was no temple.
In Solomon's time there was, okay, so in King Solomon's time that wasn't practiced.
Yeah,
But how was it practiced even in David's time? What was the core?
they did sacrifices.
Right.
Were there Pharisees?
No,
No?
in David's time, it's 1000 BCE.
Oh, 1000 BC.
That's
Before
King David's
Christ.
time. It's 1,000 before the Common Era. So if we're in that era, and it's King David or King Solomon, or it's Jeremiah or Isaiah or Obadiah, their Judaism, how do they practice their Judaism? There was a sacrificial cult, which was the core. When the temple was built by King Solomon, that's where it was centered, right? So it was centered at a place, a shrine, where sacrifices could be made for celebration, for repentance, for family events, holidays, and stuff like that, right? That's how you did it. So the central focus was there. So for example, let's look at Numbers 28. Just share, because we're only going to do this for a couple of moments. It's not a major.
28.
Yeah, it's after Numbers 27.
That's helpful.
You better tell them where Numbers is.
You're not there, you're out.
Yeah,
Oh, you got
no,
it?
what numbers, what?
Chapter 28. Is everybody?
Just the
Okay.
New Testament, so you're not going to have
Oh, we were going backwards, that far back it was gonna be at the beginning, okay.
All right, we gotta find it.
28, 24, 28.
I know. I can't. Oh, I know, it's, pages are sticking together here. That's 26.
28, what?
We got it, 28, 28 is good, that's it.
28, 28.
All right, so we're just gonna stick with this for a minute or two anyway.
Where, did you say
28,
It's
28.
Numbers chapter
Here
28,
it is.
fourth book of the Bible.
Killing the bull.
Okay, what are we looking for? Numbers.
Numbers chapter 28.
Number 6 through 28?
No, Numbers chapter 28, this is very simple, honestly. Like verse 1.
He's got it.
No, you said verse 1.
No,
Said 28,
chapter
28, we're in the right
28, verse
place.
1.
We're gonna read about it.
No, verse 1.
Verse
Verse
1.
1, the
Which
Lord
is the
spoke to
beginning.
Moses.
This is really
jeez.
tough, I didn't know I was asking such a hard question.
We understood 28, 28.
I
Long
know,
eyes,
so.
some of us have been on
Yeah.
it.
You kept saying 28.
Yeah, you gotta bring them in and
You
all
got
the
two?
good names are outside.
All
the
right,
Bible.
so somebody read. Would
The
somebody,
Lord commanded Moses to instruct the Israelites.
wait, you're not in the right chapter. Book, it's
Sorry,
Numbers.
yeah.
It's a different
It
version.
might be
It's a
different
different
versions.
translation, that's all.
It's gonna take a little while to settle it.
Numbers chapter 28.
Just,
To
It's a different
present,
version,
go
we have
ahead.
different versions.
All right, start again, I'm sorry. Sorry.
The Lord commanded Moses to instruct the Israelites to present to God at the appointed times the required food offerings that are pleasing to Him. These are the food offerings that are to be presented to the Lord. For the daily burnt offering, 2 one-year-old male lambs without any defects. Offer the first lamb in the morning and the second in the evening, each with a grain offering
Okay,
of...
thank you. So, there's a commandment to offer sacrifices on a daily basis, right? Morning and evening. If you go down to verse 9, for the Sabbath day, 2 yearling lambs without blemish, a grain offering of 2/10 of an ephah of flour, etc., etc. And then if you go to verse 16, you'll see it says, the Passover of the Lord shall be held on the 14th day of the month, and here's the sacrifices, and on it goes. So if you wanted to know how to conduct yourself as a Jewish person, if you were King David, you would say, this is what I do. Daily, a morning and afternoon sacrifice, and then something special on Sabbath, and then Passover and the other holidays. Of course, you, David, wouldn't have done it. Who would have done the sacrifices? Priests, right? There was a hereditary priesthood, all of them descendants of Aaron, out of the tribe of Levi. So there were priests, hereditary priests, and the mode of worship was exactly what we have here. This many sacrifices here, and ultimately they come to the conclusion it's to be done in a central shrine, which becomes the temple in Jerusalem. And that's the core of biblical Judaism. I mean, there are ethical commandments and this and that, but the core of worship is this. What were you thinking?
I'm just surprised that's what it was.
Why? What did you think? What were you thinking? That's important.
The sacrifice part,
That was so central?
yeah. But of course, it was animal sacrifice,
Yes,
right?
yes.
But still.
Well, it was. Yeah, that's what they did. That's what they did.
Unlike other religions in the area that sacrifice human beings.
Right, right. So that's what you
Was
got.
it white?
What? Well,
Was
somewhat.
born white?
Yeah, it's not what we, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, then what did they do? I think I know where those is from, but, I mean, was there some words, a series of words, or a service, or a?
That's the question, isn't there? It's not referred to here in any way. No, apparently, the priests were in charge of this, and this is what they did. There's no reference to any words, like, thanks for the food, God, or something like that. There's no reference to that at all. That's important. Biblical Judaism does apparently not have any prayers. Now, there are prayers in the Hebrew Bible. When Miriam, sister of Moses, becomes very ill, God says, Moses says, heal her, please, God. And Abraham expresses a prayer or two, and David writes psalms. And so some of them might have been said in the temple, but we're not clear 100%. That it's not, it doesn't, there's no manual. There's no prayer manual. So there's no prayer book, exactly. Let's just look at one other to illustrate this. Leviticus chapter 16.
Is it? I think so.
It's before.
Oh, it's before.
Yes.
Screwed it up.
16.
Okay. 16 or 16?
1:6. Chapter 16.
What if 19?
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, it's the third.
Book before Numbers.
With all the rules?
Okay. So if you look here, is everybody there? Leviticus chapter 16. It starts, sorry, I'm going to hold it up. Of course, I'm reading 15, no, 16, okay. I want to pick it up at, wait, why is this looking different than, what is this? Hold on.
All these Christians, they went and changed.
I just want to pick it up in a spot that's easy to pick up here. I'm sorry,
What, this one?
No. All right, pick it up at chapter 11, verse 11, sorry, chapter 16, verse 11, I'm sorry.
11
Okay.
is right there.
Okay.
Okay?
Aaron.
Aaron shall present his bull offering as a sin offering, making expiation for himself and his household, and then slaughter the bull as a sin offering, etc., etc. You see that?
Yeah.
So Aaron makes some kind of offering for expiation, and then if we go a little bit further into the chapter, verse 15, Aaron shall then slaughter the people's goat as a sin offering, bringing its blood within the veil, etc., etc. And then verse 20, when Aaron has finished making expiation for the sanctuary, for the tent of the presence, and for the altar, he shall bring forward the live goat. He shall lay both his hands on its head and confess over it all the iniquities of the Israelites and all their actions of rebellion, that is, all their sins. This is a celebration and observance of what holiday, do you think?
Oh, the one that's coming up.
The one that's coming up.
Rosh
It's not Rosh Hashanah. That
Yom
is
Kippur.
Yom Kippur, right?
Saturday.
The Day of Atonement.
Saturday.
Right. Now, look what's being, you know that nowadays, Yom Kippur, this Day of Atonement, which is a week from Friday and Saturday, right? Rosh Hashanah is tomorrow night. But Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is next weekend. And you know that Jews spend the day in the synagogue with a prayer book. But apparently here, it's Aaron doing a variety of sacrifices to expiate for his sins, for his family's sins, for the people's sins. There's a scapegoat in here. And at the very end, it says, I'll show you where, you don't even know it's Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, until you get to the very, very end of the chapter. Verse 29. This shall become a rule binding on you for all time. Everyone there?
Yeah.
On the 10th day of the 7th month, you shall, what says here, mortify yourselves. You shall do no work, whether native Israelite or alien settler, because on this day expiation shall be made on your behalf. The next verse, this is a Sabbath of sacred rest for you. So, in the end, it is the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. But the way biblical Judaism is set up, you get all the sacrifices and all that, and that's how you do this day. There's no prayer at all that we can discern, or all that.
Well, this is the seventh month, so apparently their calendars were different.
Yes, they were.
Than ours.
Still are.
Yeah, no, but they counted the calendar from spring
Oh.
in biblical Judaism. That is another change, but I'm not so interested in that one for now. So what I just want to establish is King David, Solomon, Jeremiah, and Isaiah, if you ask them, what does it mean for you to be a Jew? They say to be a good person and all of that, because that's all there too. Love your neighbor as yourself. But they say when it comes to what you do as a Jew, in religious terms, you follow you make sure that the priests are able to do the sacrifices on behalf of the whole Jewish people at the right time, the right place, for the right purpose. And that's biblical Judaism. It's sacrifice-centered, it's Jerusalem-centered, it's temple-centered. But we know that's not Judaism today. Now, you could see a little bit of a hint of change. Change, that's our theme, right? If you just look at, it's not even the Judaism that Jesus knew. If you just look at Mark chapter 6. So, I'll take this one. This is a whole Bible? Okay. So let's go to Mark. Oh my gosh, this is a big one. We're in Mark chapter 6.
That's Mark.
It's Mark, Matthew.
This is just the old?
Mark or Matthew?
No, it's in, oh yeah, this is just the old, this is just the new,
So
right?
Matthew and Mark.
Actually, they
Yeah,
can
Matthew, then
Mark,
go
Luke,
to
and
Mark.
John. That's the
Mark.
one the scarf lands
Mark
on.
what?
Oh, this is, yeah, this is an interesting one. It doesn't give you chapter numbers, so that won't help.
learned that.
All right, you want, oh, what's this?
So what are we looking for, Mark? What?
Spell out. All right, we want Mark chapter 6.
Oh, no, this is old too.
Mark chapter 6.
Oh, wait, there it is, there it is.
So just, so you're all with me, remember we established that Isaiah, Jeremiah, King David, King Solomon would have known a Judaism that is temple-centered, priesthood-centered, and focused on the sacrifices led by the priests. However, that's biblical Judaism. When you get to the time of Jesus, Mark chapter 6, is it verse 1? Let me just see if I can get it. Where does chapter 6 start?
That's Mark 5, teach.
This is 6.
6 is up here. Who left
Oh, here it is,
place?
very bottom. Okay, Mark, okay. Does someone want to read the opening part of chapter 6? Linda, sure. Sure.
He left that place and went to his hometown, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and the large congregation who heard him were amazed.
Stop, that's good enough. What's happened?
We're in the synagogue instead of the
Right.
temple.
When the Sabbath comes, he goes to the synagogue where apparently there are a group of Jews, and he teaches them. I don't know what else they're doing there currently, but do you see there is something that Isaiah and Jeremiah would have not known this. They would not known about a synagogue. They would not have known that that's a place where you could go on Sabbath or would go on Sabbath. That's something different. Something's happened. Something's changed. And if you look at Luke chapter 4, we'll see again a change. Luke
Yeah.
chapter 4. There it is. We're going to take it at 15. 4:15. I'll start at 14, that's where this one starts. Then Jesus, armed with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee. And reports about him spread through the whole countryside. He taught in their synagogues, and all men sang his praises. Now, it's a little bit more, there's a little bit more detail about what happens in the synagogue. So let's read, okay? Somebody? Go.
So he came to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up, and went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as he regularly did.
Oh, that's something new. So on a regular basis, Jews are going to the synagogue. Go ahead.
He stood up to read the lesson and was handed the scroll of the prophet Isaiah.
That's good enough for me. What's different?
Written in.
There's a text, and apparently people are studying a text. In this case, it's Isaiah. It could have been something else. But, so, all I know then is biblical Judaism is sacrificial cult, and it's centered on the sacrifices in Jerusalem, at the temple with a capital T. That's what it is, right? And then all of a sudden, some years go by. I got David, Psalm, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Years go by. Jesus is there. Let's say it's the year 25 CE. We'll say it's 20, okay? 25 CE, right? And what is this? There's something called a synagogue. And Jesus goes to a synagogue, and on one occasion, he teaches there, and he reads a text. In this case, Isaiah. Maybe he read another text on another weekend. But that is a difference. Something has happened. Something's changed. And we want to figure out how this all happened. So let's give Jesus the date. We'll say he's an adult man in the year 30. So in the year 30, he's there. And we know, can anyone give me a date? I said King David. What was David's date? I did mention it.
1000
800
BC.
1000 BCE is David. It's easy to remember that one. Solomon's 960 BCE. And if you put Isaiah at 580 or 600 BCE. So, in the course of those 6 centuries, not surprisingly, things have changed, from Isaiah through to Jesus. Things have changed. All of a sudden, or maybe not so all of a sudden, there was something called the synagogue. Now, Jesus lives in the time, the Jerusalem temple's still there, right? Because that's where he goes in the end. And sacrifices are being made in the Jerusalem temple. It is biblical Judaism, but it's biblical Judaism 2.0. There's a little bit of something extra here. There's a thing called the synagogue. So does anybody know where the synagogue comes from? It's a Greek word. It means assembly, place of assembly. And where does it come from? Do you have any sense? You just might happen to know. I do know, but do you have any sense?
Oh, tell us.
Oh yeah, all right, so first of all, nobody knows for sure. Because no one wrote, those days they didn't say, today we invented the synagogue. People didn't do those things. What seems to have happened is this. The first temple is destroyed in the year
500.
close, yeah, that approximately is 586 BCE, right?
Yeah.
And we know that we're going to put Jesus in, let's do this, 30 CE. When the temple's destroyed with a capital T, it's destroyed, what happens to the Jewish people then? You remember by any chance? There's a dispersion.
Dispersed.
Who destroys the temple? Starts the Babylonians, right? Babylonia. The Babylonians destroy it, and they take a good number of Jewish leaders off into Babylonia, which is modern-day Iraq. So there's an exile. There's the Babylonians, and there's an exile. And it's believed that perhaps somewhere in the course of that exile, since Jews are, I don't know how far Iraq is from Israel, but let's say it's 1,000 miles. Since Jews are exiled and away from, so far away, and the temple's destroyed, they begin to assemble nonetheless, in spite of themselves or because they need to, in local groupings. And they come, ultimately, the institution or the thing in which they meet is called the synagogue. It's like an institute, it's a little thing. And when they go back, if they do go back and they do build another temple, the synagogue kind of goes back. And so even though the focus of biblical Judaism is on the temple, capital T, see that, in Jerusalem, lowercase s synagogues start to kind of appear. And Jews appear, look, Jesus shows up, and he apparently regularly showed up, or others did. So the synagogue sort of starts to become this parallel institution. It's there, and people are reading. We don't know what else they're reading yet, but they're reading Isaiah. Jesus is called forward to read a bit of Isaiah, and they're maybe reading some other things as well. So something is happening.
And we assume the animal sacrifices aren't taking place in the synagogue.
No, because the Torah is very clear. They're to be done in the temple. So the temple gets rebuilt. Yeah, the temple gets rebuilt about I don't know, I'm forgetting. Temple gets rebuilt up in the about 480s or something like that. Yes, gets rebuilt, and sacrifices resume. And so there's the temple, and everything's all's well in the world. But there's temple 1, and there's temple 2, and the pivotal date is what date? Something's going to happen.
Temple 2 gets destroyed.
Temple 2 gets destroyed, yes, in what year? Yes, that's the key. So let's just put Jesus here. In 70 CE, all bets are off.
The Romans destroyed.
Yes, the Romans
The
destroyed.
Romans destroyed.
Yeah. Oops. Temple is just the destruction of the second temple takes place. This is a pivotal event. The first temple was major, but the second temple is the destruction of the second temple and of Jerusalem is a pivotal, catastrophic, turning point event in Jewish history. Because if the temple's gone, then everything that the Bible tells you to do is no longer possible. You can't do the sacrifices. You're stuck. What are you going to do?
The goats and
So-
sheep are happy.
Pardon me?
The goats and sheep are happy.
Animal farm is back. So
Yes, we
you're up a creek. This is a huge, because remember we're talking about change. This is one of those pivot moments in all of Jewish history. This one, when the temple got destroyed, was very, very important. But for any number of reasons, the Jewish people kind of held on and the temple got rebuilt. But here, when the Romans destroy it, there are people who still hope it will be rebuilt, and there are little movements to sort of rebuild it, but it's done. And therefore, you are at a huge turning point. I can't emphasize it too much. 70 CE, it's one of the grand turning points in all of Jewish history. It changes everything. Because the Bible's built on the assumption you're going to do sacrifices and a priest will do it. But you don't need any priests anymore because you don't have any sacrifices to do and the temple's gone. You had a question?
What was the role then of the synagogue?
Aha, we'll have to figure that out. Yes, right. Well, good luck, because in essence, the synagogue was there as an alternate institution. It was a place that Jews had been frequenting for study, and we think maybe for saying some kinds of prayers. Remember how there was a daily sacrifice? When was it given? Morning and
Night.
Remember Numbers, hang on, Numbers chapter 28, there was a daily sacrifice in the morning and in the evening.
Uh-huh.
It appears as if, we don't know, that as time had gone by, Jews had been assembling in their synagogues, certainly on Sabbath, because Jesus is there. The gospel writer doesn't make anything out of it, just takes it for granted. They were there. So by the year 30, it must be commonplace that Jews are assembling in that synagogue in Galilee, in Nazareth, which is, I don't know, 70 miles from Jerusalem or something like that. And they're there. So if they're there, that means they're reading and studying, and they're probably doing something. They're saying something. Maybe they're saying a song or whatever. We don't exactly know, but it's the synagogue that's going to become, from a minor institution, into the savior of Judaism. So this cute little thing, all of a sudden, what had been kind of an afterthought or a holding operation, suddenly when there's no temple, you got to say, well, what are we going to do now? And what we do is the synagogue becomes a central organization, the central operating principle. But the priests can't, they're out of a job because they were good guys, they were butchers. Well, they were It's a butcher's union. They don't, they're on, it's like the hat guys. It's like the hat guys, right? I was the best, I could slaughter a ram better than anybody. But no one wants you to do that anymore. We don't need you to slaughter a ram anymore because we don't have a temple in which to do it. So they're all on jobs. So it looks as if somewhere along here, there'd begun to be an additional group of teachers, of leaders, and there are the rabbis. People who come to be called rabbis. Rabbi means teacher. So they're teaching in synagogues and they're leading sort of in synagogues a little bit. But the problem is, we're still missing the heart of it. So they got some rabbis who can help you read something or they're teaching something. The question is, what do you do nonetheless on a day-by-day basis? How do you conduct Jewish life? And that's what the year 70 is, this huge demarcation point. And it's the rabbis who essentially reinvent Judaism. They just say, we're going to do it differently now. Here's what we're going to do. Questions before we talk about what they did? Yes?
I've heard synagogues referred to as, oh, we're going to the temple.
Oh, that's right.
But that must be little t temple.
Right, so exactly. So the synagogue, of which I'm the Rabbi Emeritus, is Sinai Temple.
Oh.
Or you've met Rabbi Katz, I think Amy Katz has been here on occasion,
we know
from Temple Bethel. So when the word temple is used nowadays, it's used as a little t temple, just another name for a synagogue. So there are no temples like that anywhere in the Jewish world. There are no temples. There's only one place where a temple could be, and that's in Jerusalem. So you actually have some far right-wing Jews in the Jewish world who are anticipating and hoping that the third temple will be built. You only have to deal with one problem: the mosque that's on top of it. So they're making plans. Some of them, if they had their way, would bomb it and build up, and they put this in place. But we're not going there. That's another political story. So now we got to deal with that. Imagine this huge cavernous hole. How do you fill it? How do you go about being Jewish in a world that you've never encountered before? That's the problem. Any other questions before we see how they do it?
Well, I have a question, because I'm thinking about it, because the other change is the appearance of writing, right? So it just seems like the destruction of the temple was this big tangible change, but was there this big incremental change as things began to be written, and so there became this role for the rabbis? Yeah, I'm just thinking about change and whether it's a big marker, like all of a sudden one day the temple was gone and we had to do something else, or was it really that gradually that synagogue was taking over from?
Well, everything's grad. Before the temple's destroyed, you're right, Jesus shows up
Like how
and
big would the synagogue have been at
29 CE.
Yeah.
Well, Jesus in 30 CE shows up in the synagogue and he reads the prophet Isaiah. So that means someone wrote down Isaiah's writings. And the Bible is being written down, so there's a text to learn. The Torah, those first 5 books, probably gets put in written form around the year 450. So that means that people are reading it and studying it they're already been doing it for quite a while. So there's probably a tradition of, well, this is what it means to us in our time and whatever. But they could have been reading Torah the whole time, and they would have been reading Numbers 28, which we did, and Leviticus 16, which we just did, and the way you observe Yom Kippur was those sacrifices in the temple, and Sabbath and all that. So even if they were studying, and there's a growing tradition of some text being written, the core of it, the spine, the heart of it, is the temple. And when that goes in the year 70, you've got to jumpstart and come up with something. So the rabbis do that. And they're the ones who do it, and they're the ones who create Judaism as we know it. So that really, the Judaism all before this is biblical Judaism, all of the Judaism which exists now is rabbinic Judaism. It's their Judaism. So if Isaiah or Moses came along and went to my synagogue, they would just be, what? They would be completely baffled. They'd recognize something.
Yeah, I hear y'all have guitar music now.
Yeah, well, that would be the least of their problems. That would be, but they would be completely baffled by it. Of course, if Paul came along and went to church here, he too would be completely baffled. But that's because change happens in many ways. But let's find out what the rabbis do, okay? So what they do is, they fill the vacuum, as it were. They fill the vacuum when the temple's gone with other things to do. Among the things they do is they say, if we can't do the sacrifices, we can study the sacrifices. And so they say, we can't do them, we'll study them. And that'll be temporarily, will be as good as having done them. It's kind of an ingenious little thing, right? They don't throw their hands up and say, no sacrifices, we're done. They say, no sacrifices, let's read the text. And that'll be as good for the time being as doing it. And while they're at it, they begin to develop some prayers too. Probably Psalms were being read already, maybe the 10 Commandments were being read already, and the rabbis develop prayers. And they say, we're going to get together and we're going to read. Well, we're going to read, we're going to say things together, and that'll have to be our substitute. Everybody with me? So let's take a look. We know, I think my best example of this is that when the temple's destroyed, imagine you're playing football, but you don't know, for those of you who don't know, football's played in 4 quarters. And you don't know what quarter you're in, all right? You're just out there playing football, and it's you against the Romans. And the Romans, by summer of 70, have got you on your own 1-yard line, and they're pushing hard, and they're coming on, and they're going to score, and you don't know what quarter you're in. Well, if some of you, the guys in the Jewish team, are saying, we're finished, it's the end of the game, they're on our 1-yard line, they're going to score, and we're done for. Other people say, no, we've got one more chance, let's not give it up. And so the guy who's the quarterback, one of these rabbi guys, says, just don't worry about it. Go down far, and I'll hit you. So all the rabbis run down 20 yards, 30 yards, and Tom Brady of the Jews throws this insane pass, and one of the rabbis catches it on the 40-yard line, and the buzzer goes, but it turns out it was only half time. The rest of the game remains. And now we're on the 40-yard line. We're good to go. We're way behind. The Romans are behind us, and now we've got a future. Those who thought the game was over, but the rabbi said, we're not done yet. And if we throw one into the future, if we launch something new into the future, it's going to work out. And lo and behold, it was only half time. It wasn't even. It was like the first quarter was over, and the rest has all unfolded. So you can remember that we're at the very, very end, and then wham, Tom Brady saves the day. I don't think Tom Brady is Jewish, but you get the idea. So let's see how they do that, all right? And what they do, we know what they did, in part because it's memorialized in one of the first rabbinic books that comes out in the 130s, let's say 130, it's called the Mishnah, which is like a mini encyclopedia of Jewish practice. So let's look at some examples of stuff from the Mishnah, which will illustrate what they do to fill the vacuum. So if you'll take one.
Thank you.
Now this is no joke. They were on the brink of disaster. We should have enough time. We're good. Okay. So I call this responding to catastrophe, which is the destruction of the temple. How the rabbis adapted and created Jewish prayer for Jewish survival. The following paragraphs come from the Mishnah, a tractate, a booklet called brachot, which means blessings. These laws began to develop orally before and especially after the catastrophe. They were written down in the 180s. Actually, that's true. It's my mistake. This is my thing. They were written in the 180s when the Mishnah was created. So, the prayer or the text which the rabbis decide is going to be the central prayer is this thing from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. That is the prayer that they say is the seminal prayer. So we got to take back 180. Okay, now it's in Deuteronomy chapter 6, and in Deuteronomy chapter 6, we won't look now, it's just part of a speech Moses makes. He says, hey, Jews, people of Israel, God is one. The rabbis decided that this is going to become the central prayer. They just decided that. We're going to make this the central prayer. And remember the sacrifices happen morning and evening? So the rabbi said, let's say it morning and evening. Yes?
Is there a record of an organization of rabbis who vote, like the Council of Nicaea, where people all got together and decided it on the Nicene Creed? Is there a historical?
Yeah, the Sanhedrin, everyone knows that, right?
Yeah.
The Sanhedrin is the kind of parliament of the rabbis, and they have meetings, and they talk about some meetings that they had in the Mishnah where they made decisions about the nature of what was going to be said and not said and all that stuff. Yeah, it's not, but it's different than like the early church fathers getting together and various assemblies. Why is it different? It's maybe different because, see, the church fathers knew they were inventing something. I mean,
They were consolidating orthodoxy as well.
And working out conflicts.
yeah, so but the problem that the rabbis had is, on the one hand, they were creating rabbinic Judaism. Because there's nowhere that it says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, is a prayer that has to be said by Jews. They decided it was. But they don't, they maintain that everything they're doing is what God wants. So on the one hand, they're saying, hey, this is what the Torah means, and we're just telling you, just bring it to you. On the other hand, they're just making it up. So they're making it up, but they can't admit that they're making it up. So they can't exactly say, on this event, we made up the following things. It's sort of just got to be, they're reflecting what is the case and what is the Torah and what is reality. Does that make sense? Whereas the church fathers agreed, didn't say we're making it up because they thought they had truth, but they were willing to be more, to say, yeah, we're voting on this.
Somebody had to make a decision.
Yeah, we're making a decision on this. The rabbis were a little more, didn't want to be quite so straightforward about that. Let's go to page 4 then, of this thing. Because it sort of shows the back page. The rabbis had a problem. Because remember, I know what the problem is. Here's the problem. It's good that you asked this. The Jews made the sacrifices and did the sacrifices because it was in the Torah, which was given by God. So they were following God's commandments. This is what you do on Shabbat, or this is what you do on Yom Kippur, or whatever, right? So when the temple's gone, then you can't follow God's word anymore. So what are you going to do? So the rabbis know they've got to come up with something, but it's a little awkward as to how they're going to go about doing it because they're not God. So take a look at what they do. They look at See, I wrote at the top, how do the rabbis see themselves as teachers? How do they understand their role in keeping the Torah alive? So they take a text from Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 8 through 11. This paragraph became the basis for the rabbi's way of interpreting and teaching and adapting the Torah to changing times both before and especially after 70 CE. Okay? So let's have one of the ladies on this side read this text, please. Go ahead.
Observe.
If a case.
If a case.
Plus, yeah, I was going, but I got confused by something before that. Okay, if a case is too baffling for you to decide, be it a controversy over homicide, civil law, or assault, you shall repair to the places that the Lord your God will have chosen and appear before the Levitical priests or the magistrate in charge at the time and present your problem. When they have announced to you the verdict in the case, you shall carry out the verdict. You shall act in accordance with the instructions given to you and the ruling handed down to you.
Which of those phrases is going to be the one that is the pivotal phrase that the rabbis will use? This doesn't seem to have anything to do with the issue at hand, except for one phrase in there. It's going to be the key
Carry
one.
out the verdict.
You should repair
That's
Handed
secondary.
down to you.
What?
You should repair to the place the Lord has chosen.
That would be Jerusalem. That is going to be critical.
The instructions given to you and handed to you.
No,
The
no.
magistrate, or the magistrate in charge, if you're not with the Levitical priest.
Exactly. The phrase that counts is, or the magistrate in charge at the time. So the text is saying here, if you come across something which you haven't encountered before, go to Jerusalem and speak to the priest, or to the magistrate in charge at the time, and listen to whatever that leadership person tells you. That's the key phrase that the rabbis find. See, they're trying, they know they have a catastrophe on their hands. No more Judaism if we just try and do sacrifices, because you can't do them anymore. So what do? They find a verse in their constitution which probably never meant what they take it to mean, but it works perfectly. Because they say, we're the magistrates in charge in this time. Are you following me or not? I don't hear see eyes lighting up.
No, we
got it.
the bulb went off.
Everybody okay? So the rabbis they find this little paragraph, which is there, and it clearly happens to say the priests in Jerusalem or the magistrate in charge at the time, which could have been written for any number of reasons when it was written. But the rabbis say that means that in our time, the year 71 BCE, the priests are no longer working. They're like the hat guys. They're out of a job. We're the magistrates in charge. So what we say goes. And it's not like a hostile takeover or something like that. But it's right here in the text. It's right here in the text. And it becomes their proof text for saying, we are the inheritors. We're the guys who inherit the mantle of leadership and deciding how to go about doing things. It's really a brilliant use of text. Imagine that they're the Supreme Court, and you go to the Supreme Court to say, I don't know, is it legal to ban Muslims or not? Or is abortion permissible or not? And, well, abortion's not even mentioned in the Constitution, but the Supreme Court finds it. And a ban on Muslim refugees is nowhere mentioned in the Constitution, but the Supreme Court finds it, right? The Supreme Court finds all this stuff, or donations to political parties. It's always there if you read the text broadly and creatively. And here too, the rabbis say, here's our Constitution, here's our rationale. We are the magistrates today who are in the business of survival. Now in the Mishnah, they come up with they fill in the blanks about who's in charge. So if someone could read that next little paragraph. In the Mishnah, you can see.
Okay, in the Mishnah, you can see the rabbis talking about their role in transmitters of Torah from Mount Sinai right on up to their own time.
They wrote, go ahead.
Moses received the Torah from God at Mount Sinai and handed it down to Joshua and Josiah and Joshua.
No, Joshua.
Oh, okay,
Joshua.
both there, to his followers. And those
It should be Joshua to his followers.
to his
Too bad I can't type.
and those followers handed in to the prophets, and the prophets handed the Torah on to the sages of Ezra's time. These teachers passed the Torah on down to
Now,
him.
I'll get these guys, as
Okay.
And here they name some of the rabbis, Hillel, Yochanan ben Zakkai, Akiba, and the sages of later generations. So, the Deuteronomy passage says the magistrates in charge of the time, and in the Mishnah, the rabbis spell it out and say, guess what? Torah came from God at Mount Sinai, it went to Joshua, onwards through the prophets, and all through different traditions, and we are the direct inheritors of the Word of God. We are those guys who stand in the sandals of those guys. Does that make sense? I'm looking at you. Tom, does it make sense?
Oh, yeah, it's great, yeah.
Do you see how they've done it? Oh, we walk in, what's it? In Peter's shoes. What's it called? What's the phrase? The Pope stands in the footsteps of Peter or something, isn't it?
Yeah, upon this rock, he puts, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, wasn't there a book by Morris West that was called
Shoes of the fisherman.
Shoes of the
Yeah,
Fisherman,
fisherman.
right. We're in the shoes of the fisherman. What was that a reference to?
Peter.
Yeah, shoes of the fisherman. So they're walking in the shoes of Moses. They are a new Moses, as it were. Very cool, isn't it? All right, so let's go to the front. We got to see now. So how do they handle it? Any questions about this? I don't want to. This is sort of like what? So page 4 then establishes their authority, what we just read.
Okay.
Now we'll go to the front. And what they're going to do is they're going to say, hey, we have no way to pray because the sacrifices are gone, but we do have a way to pray because we are going to legislate a way to pray. And here they go. So, here's the opening of this booklet on how do you pray after the temple. So, let's go ahead and read. Who's going to read for us? When did we say, oh, the Shema, sorry. The Shema, you see it there?
Yeah.
That's the Hebrew word for that prayer, Deuteronomy 6:4, Hear, O Israel. So, when they say, when do we say the Shema, they mean, when do we say Deuteronomy 6:4? Yeah, okay? So, someone needs to read for us, and we'll see what happens.
When do we say the Shema? In the evening. We can start to say the Shema from the moment the sun begins to set. We can say it up until midnight. When is the right time to say the Shema in the morning? We can start to say the Shema as soon as we can see the difference between the blue and white threads on the prayer shawl.
You've seen the prayer shawl and what have you. So here then, the rabbis are just jumping right in, and they're saying, this is chapter 1, verse 1 of this tractate. They're already saying, they already know, everyone's saying it, we just want to establish, this is when we're going to do it. And why do they choose to do it morning and evening? Because that's when the sacrifices were done. That was Numbers 28. They're filling the blank. You can always think about it. The rabbis fill the blank. There was a hole. There's a hole in the bucket. Dear Liza. There's a hole in our bucket. We can't do sacrifices. So the rabbis come along and say, we'll fill your hole. We'll fill it, dear Liza, by saying the Shema, the morning and evening, because that's when we did it. The morning and evening is when we will say it, and that's it.
And they're so precise about that.
Yes, well, they've got to be precise, because everything's gone awry. The world is in check. There's chaos, it's catastrophe. The world's fallen apart. So, if it's fallen apart, you better pull it back together with exactitude. This is when we're going to say the Shema. First of all, we're going to say it twice, because that's to fill the hole in the absence of the sacrifices, and we're going to say it at this time and at that time. So no questions to be asked. Okay, now, they don't stop there, and they come up with something additional. So let's continue on. Who was reading? Go ahead.
What blessing do we say over fruits?
Who said we said a blessing over fruits? It's because the rabbis are saying everything's in disarray, there's chaos. We're now going to figure out a way to organize life. That's the operative principle. How do we organize, how do we take chaos and make it orderly? because chaos will lead us to catastrophe, will lead us to extinction. So we've got to have, well, you're going to see, we're going to come up with more rules than you could ever imagine.
Okay.
Because it's going to give us a way to act out what we need to do. So go ahead.
Over the fruit of trees, a person says, quote, "Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, ruler of the universe, who creates the fruit of the tree," unquote. Over wine, a person says this blessing, quote, "Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, ruler of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine."
So, if I eat a plum, I say the first blessing. If I eat an apple, I say the first blessing. But I'm doing wine, that's wine's kind of processed, I say who creates the fruit of the vine. And wine has a special quality in the Middle East because, well, in a world where water might not be so good for you, wine was a pretty sure thing. You knew you could safely make yourself something to drink with the wine. They cut it, it was very thick and they mixed it with water, but the wine was significant. So Jesus, of course, says, "This is my blood, but drink the wine." Because wine was significant in the world that he knew, the Jewish world that he knew. So what I'm walking, yes?
Did they, every time they were drinking wine, say this, or was this for the vines where they were planting?
Keep going for a second. I think we'll have an answer to that. I think we'll get there in a second, okay?
Okay.
So let me read the next one, over fruits.
Over fruits of the earth, such as a potato, or over a vegetable, such as a green bean, a person says, "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who creates the fruit of the
You
ground."
can see that, right? Because they're in the ground.
Yeah.
Okay, go
Over
ahead.
bread, a person says, "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth."
Okay, so that is the classic grace that Jews, at a meal, for example, bread is understood to be like the staff of life. So at any meal, what you would do, you wouldn't say a blessing over everything that's on the table, like here's the meat, and here's a potato, and here's a carrot, and you wouldn't say a blessing for each one. If you're having a whole meal, then the blessing, which kind of covers all bases, is that fourth one over the bread. Because once you've said that, you've said it for everything. Okay? More or less, there's some exception, but more or less for our purposes. But you see what they're doing here. So they're saying that when you eat, here's what you do over this or that, and there'd be a blessing. They didn't mention ice cream, but there'd be a blessing for that, or there'd be a blessing for Jell-O, and you figure all that stuff out, and you'd have a blessing for everything. But remember, the point is not to make your life complicated. What would the point be? Not to make your life complicated, but to make your life what?
Orderly.
Orderly. And what would you? Cohesive, yes. Cohesive, coherent, orderly.
Well, and to
Organized.
remember God.
Yes, it would definitely do that. It would orient your life towards God, because one of the things all of us do more than almost anything else we do actually is eat. So if you're mindful of that, you've got a different orientation towards the world altogether. So in the first paragraph, we're taking care of kind of like congregational worship, right? You say the Shema morning and evening. They don't say it here, but their assumption is you're going to do it in a community of Jews. The second one, that's directed to you on your own, because you eat your apple on your own, right? Or you have dinner maybe with a family or others, but you're sort of on your own, right? Let's do the next one, because this is really an interesting one, okay? Number 3, who's going to read? Somebody else. Go ahead, please.
If a person sees shooting stars, earthquakes, lightning, thunder, or storms, he should say, "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, whose power and might fill the world." If a person sees mountains, hills, seas, rivers, or deserts, he should say, "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who is the author of creation."
I like that, right? That's taking it totally beyond where we were, right? And by the way, you don't find this in the Hebrew Bible. That's not because the Hebrew Bible doesn't concern itself with this, right? I mean, the Psalms are reflective of awe and all that, but this is different. The rabbis have invented something called a blessing. You know, when you and I use the word blessing, you think like, oh, yeah, if you have a grandchild, oh, it's such a blessing in my life. In that regard, would be such a nice thing, right? A beautiful something in my life. When they use the word blessing, they mean this liturgical formula. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe. They mean a formula that begins with those words, and it ends, as you can see, differently in many cases. So blessing is a very specific liturgical formula that they're using.
And only
So-
males said them.
No, they didn't say anything about males.
It says he, so.
No, that's just for one of another. No. That's not an issue that we're dealing with right now about men and women. Go ahead, Tom. I didn't need to be abrupt about
That's all
that,
right.
but it's not an issue right now that they're concerned about. You're right. You and I are bringing gender stuff, and that's another conversation. Right now, they're worried about men, anybody saying any blessings to organize the Jewish people, okay?
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah, Tom.
Was it a huge change to suddenly have the whole community offering blessings? I mean, it must have been, but.
Well, what do you mean?
How does that, if, for example, here, the one of us blesses the Holy Communion, just one of us. But imagine suddenly everyone in the congregation is blessing everything. We have a different liturgical sense of it, but for the community all to be blessing these things, whatever they are, I would imagine would be a huge change in the hearts of the worship of the faithful.
Well, remember, if someone's eating an orange, they're not eating it in synagogue. I'm not being facetious, but they're eating it on their own or with a friend, so they'd be saying it. Of course, if you're over here and then down the street and someone else is home, they're having an orange, they're saying the blessing too. It's true. Well, one of the things about rabbinic Judaism is that it democratizes Judaism.
Yeah.
Because who's on Sabbath, who's doing the sacrifices in the Bible? Priest in Jerusalem. If you're in Nazareth, you're not doing anything. So it's not at all democratic. And this is democratizing Judaism. Because now everybody, well, this is sort of what Luther did, isn't it? What do they?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, it's exactly what it is.
Everyone is his own priest.
Right, if you look at, I know when I go to Long Meadow, I look at the First Church of Long Meadow. They have a saying, I think, on their little thing outside, which advertises the worship of the day or whatever. It says something, everybody is his own priest or something. It's something like that. So what Luther did was exactly what these guys did, right? Because he broke away from the Catholic priesthood and said, we're all priests, as it were. And he translates the Bible into the vernacular. Everyone can then read it, and then it belongs to everybody. So it's the same process. So the rabbis here are democratizing what they're doing. And they're expanding it too, because they're saying, I want you to say a blessing when you have that orange, and if you're outside and you see a shooting star, say a blessing there too. And they're giving you all kinds of stuff to fill your life with stuff, because your life, there's a hole in the bucket, and you got to fill the bucket with new things. So I'm going to skip the one, because I want to make sure we keep going. Confused look.
My puzzle look
Yeah.
is it's just a word, right? And then on the next page, when it says the rabbis elaborated on the Torah's mitzvah, right?
Right.
And you were
where are
talking about.
Wait. Well, let's read that. Let's do that. All right, so the next page, which is page 2.
Oh, I thought you were gonna skip page 2.
No,
That's
no,
my page 2
All right,
part.
so
Oh, skip
let's do page
1.
2. Now, remember, we already read Leviticus chapter 16, which just told us you're supposed to have this holiday on the 7th day of the month. And it said, when we read it, something about you shall, the very end it said, you shall mortify yourselves. Remember that? You shall mortify yourselves. Elsewhere in Leviticus 23, which I've got there in italics, just look at it on the sheet, it says you shall. Okay, so stick with, now, let's go to the top of the page. We're going to see, now, oh, I know. What's the problem in the year 71 when it comes to the Day of Atonement?
There's no sacrifice.
There's no temple, there's no sacrifice. How do you make atonement? This is a really significant thing. Now, someone whose name is Jesus is going to come along and deal with that one too, right? Because Jesus' big effort is going to be, remember when, if I remember correctly, when Jesus is crucified, what happens in the temple as he dies?
Curtain rent.
The curtain is red.
The curtain is rent, as if to say, that mode of reconciliation and repentance is torn up and is no longer necessary. That's what it means. The temple is superseded by the death of Jesus. He's now the vehicle for repentance, for atonement. So the rabbis don't buy that one, but they've got another problem. That's written, by the way, well, maybe written after, after the temple's gone. But that takes place and just says Jesus' death, and Jesus becomes the vehicle for atonement, right? So the rabbis in 71, with no temple around, have to figure out how are we going to access God and get atonement? How are we going to repent? How are we going to do it? So they're going to have to figure out something because the sacrifices are gone, right? So let's just read this opening paragraph, okay? On the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, that's the Hebrew phrase. So someone just want to read the opening in bold.
Now the rabbis adapted and elaborated on the Torah's mitzvah for the Day of Atonement, that is Yom Kippur.
Go ahead.
The Torah established that there was to be a Day of Atonement, but it didn't say too precisely how the day was to be observed. The rabbis, as it were, needed to fill in the blanks. This they did in the Mishnah.
Exactly. So we're going to look at a tractate, a booklet called Yoma. And here's my verse. Observe the 10th day of the seventh month, the Day of Atonement. It shall be a sacred occasion for you. You shall afflict your souls, which many of our translations said mortify. But here's the question. What does that mean? What does it mean to mortify your soul? What does it mean to afflict your soul? Aha. That's where the rabbis say, we're the magistrates of the day, we're the interpreters. Let us tell you what we think it ought to mean. In the absence of sacrifices, and here's what they say. On the Day of Atonement, eating, drinking, washing, anointing, and putting on sandals are forbidden. Those are all ways of afflicting your soul. So they make a huge jump. The Hebrew Bible doesn't say anything about fasting on the Day of Atonement. But the rabbis make a huge jump and say, well, other than the sacrifices, all the Bible tells us is afflict our souls. So what does it mean? And they say, we think it means don't eat, don't drink, don't wash, don't anoint, like put on perfume or deodorant, and don't put on sandals. What? Put on sandals? Why would you not? Why would I do that? Talk about afflicting
Keep
your
you at
soul.
home.
But talk about afflicting yourself. If you have to walk around on pebbles, that afflicts your soul.
It says,
Yeah.
but it says sandals. It
Yeah,
doesn't say anything about any other type of shoes.
that's all they wore in those days.
Oh, true.
Right, we're in the year 180. They don't wear any shoes. They don't have. Got it?
Yep.
Now, there's another thing I didn't put in this actually, because to be honest, I designed this for a group of students. They also say don't wear leather. So don't wear leather, because leather would have been something that would be festive, be decorative, be nice to have leather straps, leather whatever. So therefore, let's say on the Day of Atonement, me, Mark Shapiro, I don't wear my regular shoes. I have these kind of thatched things, these summer things, they aren't leather, have no leather on them. So I don't wear a belt on that day. And it's a way, I think of it as a lovely way of reminding myself that my wearing leather requires that something has to die.
Can you wear suspenders? At least they will.
Well, but I don't wear, yeah, I do, but I wear like suspenders without leather. It's my way of remembering, and I don't wear this watch, which has a leather wristband. I do another watch to remember. At least once a year, I'm mindful of the fact that my pleasure requires the death of an animal.
Can you wear a metal band watch?
Anything I want, not leather, that's all.
So there's my question.
What is your
When you said, no, because the leather reminded me of the question.
Ah.
So the beginning of this, and it's my confusion because of the word mitzvah. So
Mitzvah
when
means
I-
commandment. Sorry, it means commandment.
Okay, so it means commandment, but when I've heard it used, It's been something like a mitzvah would be when you do something good, or a mitzvah is when you follow something. So when I read this and it said the Torah's mitzvah, it reads like a rule or a commandment. But then when you talked about the leather, that seems like a good thing to be doing for something other than the rule. Is
No,
it,
no,
I don't understand do you
All right,
understand
the
the
way you've
confusion on
heard, if you've
mitzvah
heard the
with
word mitzvah used in different places.
like doing a nice
It's
thing?
used inaccurately, to mean a good deed. So you do a mitzvah, a Boy Scout does a mitzvah by helping, a person cross the street. That's a mitzvah, a good deed. But that's not the accurate way it should be used. Mitzvah
Okay.
means commandment. So the mitzvah is, so the rabbis said, the mitzvah in Leviticus 23 is afflict your souls, and we interpret that to mean that it is a commandment not to eat, not to drink, not to wash, anoint, or put on sandals, or use leather. Okay?
Mhm.
That's it, that's the mitzvah. And then, of course, the next question is, well, what does eating mean? Because, well, I don't know, so what if I just want to have a mouthful just to tide myself, a couple of raisins in the morning? Can that work? So take a look. Let's read that second paragraph.
If a person
Go
ate
ahead.
something the size of a large date, or if he drank a mouthful of liquid, he is culpable for breaking the fast.
Right, so no smart stuff, huh, guys? Yeah, don't try and get away with the date, thinking that you're still fasting. Keep going.
Any foods may be included together to make up the bulk of the date, and any liquids may be included together to make up the mouthful. What a person eats and what he drinks may not be included together.
So I suppose I can have just a tiny little bit of this and a little bit of that, but you see what they're doing. They're trying to define how much is how much, and some guy's already saying, well, maybe I can do this. No, forget it, you can't do that. Let's keep going. I think that's kind of a fun one. Now look at
Are there
this.
exceptions to this rule?
Let's read it. Let's do the next. Someone else read the third one then. Who hasn't read yet? Go ahead. Oh, no. Who hasn't read yet? No sighing, but read. Go ahead.
We should not have children fast on the Day of Atonement.
There's your exception. Because
But
they're
chil-
children.
But children should practice fasting 1 year or 2 years before they are of age, so that they may become used to the commandment.
And then let's do the next one. Rabbi Matitya, son of Hirsch said, go ahead.
If a person has a sore throat, he may swallow medicine, even on Yom Kippur, since there is doubt whether life is in danger. And whenever there is doubt whether life is in danger, this overrides all commandments.
There's something. You may say, this is way too punctilious and narrow, a bulk of this and a bulk of that. But here the rabbis strike on something big, don't they? They're saying, notwithstanding you have to fast and aren't defining exactly what the fast means and exempting children, now let's talk what happens if you're sick. And now they give you a value, not just a law. And what's their value?
Life.
Yes. So, what's that song?
Try it again.
Think that too?
To life, l'chaim,
Oh,
l'chaim, to life.
Yes.
So that is the ultimate, that's the value at the core of this whole thing. That we're not fasting and all that blindly or following observances blindly. You never forget that one of the purposes of it all is life, is to hold on to life. You can't forget that. So here you see where the rabbis, there's a hole in this bucket. The Day of Atonement requires sacrifice, but if I can't do sacrifice in the year 71, what am I going to do? How am I going to achieve atonement? It's a big, big, big issue, and the rabbis say, well, you're going to achieve atonement in this way. And besides that, as time goes by, on page 1, remember we had the Shema?
Mm-hmm.
Well, as time goes by, the rabbis and later Jewish tradition developed huge amounts of prayers to be said that go along with this whole thing. That they develop also. They fill in the bucket like to overflowing, so that it's a full democratization, so everybody kind of has a role to play. I've just focused here on the fasting and all that, but there's the prayers to be said, etc., etc. Everyone with me?
Yes.
Okay, so you can see how they're doing it, and we'll look at one more thing. How the rabbis adapted and elaborated on the Torah's mitzvah commandment for charity. So, in Leviticus 19, the third page, in Leviticus 19, there is a piece here. You mind reading that right there?
When you reap the harvest of your land, such as wheat or barley, you shall not reap all the way to the corner of your field. How do you say?
Paya, don't worry about
Paya
that.
of your field, or gather whatever falls from your hands while you are harvesting. You shall also not pick your vineyard bare, or gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am Lord your God.
Okay, so here's, the Hebrew Bible here clearly has an attitude towards charity. But of course, the rabbis come along and say, you know, we ought to think of this through a little bit. What if someone's miserly and says, well, my corner is, here's my corner. I'll leave these corners right here. You see that? And another guy says, are you crazy? The corner's this. One guy says, that's my corner. The other guy says, no, that's a corner. And so the question is, what's charity? So look at paragraph 2. How large should a corner of a field be? And they talk about how much charity you're supposed to give. People left up to their own devices may be more likely to say, that's a corner. See what I just did? And left to their own devices, that's what they'll give. If encouraged, they may say, no, that's a corner, right? So the question is, what's a corner? And the rabbis get involved in trying to define that. But then they say, but wait a second. Look at paragraph 3. What if there's a bad year? We can't just tell you that a corner has to be this one if you have a bad year. Because remember, we already know wherever life is in danger, life always supersedes. So you don't starve your own family so that you can give that huge corner. Things have to be done in a reasonable, life-enhancing way. So they're the rabbis. And then if you look at the first paragraph, they come up with a lovely thing. They actually say, you're talking about how big a corner is. Actually, there's some things which have no limit. So they say, for the following things, no limited amounts are commanded. First fruits, deeds of loving kindness in the study of Torah. In other words, you can give as much first fruits, or you can give as much loving kindness or study as much as you want. There's no limit whatsoever. These are things whose fruits a person enjoys in this world and in the world to come. These are things that can be done to as much as you want. You can do any of these things. Honoring father and mother, deeds of loving kindness, making peace between people, and the study of Torah is equal to them all because it leads to them. So here they make a value statement. Before they get into the nitty-gritty of like how much do you have to give, they make an overall statement saying that there's some things that should have no limit. You should just, the sky's the limit. Do as much as you can of goodness. And the other stuff we'll worry about too. Oh, last one. If a city does not have 6 things and a scholar is not permitted to dwell in its midst, one of these must be a community fund for charity. Can't be in a city that doesn't allow for that. So here then is the way in which Judaism responds to a catastrophe of major proportion. It's the destruction of the temple, which creates a hole in the bucket, and the bucket's got to be filled. And it's got to be filled with rules and values and rules. And the Mishnah is where they start to do it, and later Jewish tradition continues to elaborate on that. And here is one way then in which change came to Judaism, and the way in which the rabbis, that generation and thereafter, kind of changed it. They literally changed and remade. They remade Judaism. Somewhat like the founder, in 1787, when the fathers, no mothers there, the founders of the USA got together. They took those Articles of Confederation, I think they were called, and they said, this will never work. But they didn't say that, and they didn't get together. They got together, I think, saying, we're just going to amend the Articles of Confederation. But what did they do?
Totally transformed.
They totally transformed it, and we're lucky that they did, because there was a hole in the bucket. And there wouldn't be any United States of America if in 1787 they hadn't taken the articles and more or less sort of like, now the rabbis they didn't put the Torah to the side, they built on it. But they also freely elaborated and read it and interpreted it. And so they created this entity called Rabbinic Judaism, which grew. So that is change. And I think our title was Change or Die.
Mhm.
Literally, if the guys, if the boys hadn't done that, it was a bunch of boys, if they hadn't done this, there would be no Judaism. It really would have run its course, and that would have been the end of it, because there would have been nothing to hold on to. So I'm glad they did what they did. And it is 8 o'clock, so we'll take one question. So we have to have one question, unless you're...
That seems to me to be a huge legacy for a person like yourself, who's a rabbi. Are these people honored and praised by name? And
Well, we have some of the names in the back.
Well, we
page.
have some here, but
Yes.
yeah. But I mean, it's kind of new information for me. I don't know much about it. They are well thought of and
Oh,
praised.
sure, yes.
And-
Everybody, not everybody, but many people know the names of
Know the
the
names.
of the most significant of the rabbis.
I mean, I know Hillel. There's an association on the college campus.
Named after Hillel the rabbi.
Rabbi the Hillel.
Right.
Yeah.
So some of these guys, and many more over time, they're known like, we know Thurgood Marshall, right? Or we know, I don't know, I'm not going to be in trouble here, but we know Thurgood Marshall, and we know FDR, and we know Abraham Lincoln. So those are the luminaries of American history, and some of the rabbis become the luminaries of Jewish history. That would be the same thing. As we all know about FDR and Abraham Lincoln and what have you, not all Jews, but those who know about some of the great rabbis of Jewish tradition who kind of innovated. These guys were the founders in this generation, but the process has continued all the way through the generations, doing this kind of interpretive work. All right, so next week, we're going to take a look at another historic period when it's change or die, do or die. And that's what we'll do. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bring this back.